Hello, welcome back. So today I have a few leftover bits on the role of theory, but I want to do that at the end once we've discussed in depth the two papers that we had for today. So I don't really care which order we go in. Thanks to Rob and Teresa for volunteering. If one of you wants to go first, I'd like to start going through these papers, and then we'll see, what time we have left and go back to theory. I have a few things there. We'll do that towards the end. So, anybody want to go first?
You can start pulling up.
Teresa, you want to go? Okay. So then, I'll hand this off to you. Are you on the Zoom call? Okay, good. So I will mute myself. What about?
Okay, so hello everyone. Today I'm gonna present the research methods behind this paper that I reviewed, which focuses on decoding why people engage in impulsive buying behaviors. So the authors begin by explaining there's a mystery behind this certain topic, because although this is badly viewed by society, almost 90% of us engage in buying behaviors one time or the other. And what they don't understand and what this research focuses on is trying to understand the underlying motives to why people are impulsive when buying, although society views it as an immature and irrational behavior. So they're going to study why it happens. In their lead review, they understand that previous studies focus on product characteristics instead of personal traits of the buyers, and why product characteristics don't impact the results as much as they thought. So they understood that people buy expensive things as well as inexpensive things at the same rate with their impulsive behavior. So it should not be correlated with that. So they shifted their focus to try and understand personal reasons related to happiness factors that may make people feel good about their purchases. They achieve this through a two-step strategy. They use qualitative and quantitative methods. In the first phase, they conduct an interview to explore these narratives and the context where people actually engage in these behaviors. And then in the second phase, they use a survey to collect data and test their hypothesis. So the question here is they didn't actually formulate research questions. They use hypotheses instead, which are somehow similar. And in the first phase, they conducted 60 interviews with a wide variety of demographics. And they didn't tell their participants that they were studying impulsive buying behaviors. They just said they were trying to understand shopping characteristics in general. And they found that through these interviews, many people like shopping because it feels therapeutic, it feels good. They like spending time with others when they go shopping. It improves their view of themselves, and it just makes them feel better with themselves. They use ground theory, which is basically a method to derive the hypothesis from the data and not the other way around. So they allow it to directly emerge from the interview data, then starting with rigid hypothesis. They iteratively evaluate these hypotheses until theoretical saturation is reached, and this means that they don't want repetitive things to be tested, so they use other theories to make sure that their hypotheses are not saturated. So they end up formulating 5 hypotheses, and I put 6 here because they divided the 5th one in A and B. They're going to study the hedonic needs of people, questions related with happiness, fun, novelty, and surprise when shopping impulsively. Also social needs, interacting with other people, spending time with their loved ones. They actually investigate esteem and style questions related to how other people perceive their purchases in a way that makes them look better in society. In the 4th hypothesis, they are concerned about the accuracy in which the consumers perceive their own purchases. And in the 5th one, they are concerned with the efforts. And this means that they are trying to understand the correlation between the effort put into a decision made when buying a certain product and the perceived accuracy that the consumers have about it. So we know that we live in a world when we go shopping, there's a lot of variety. We are extremely exhausted by the things that are in front of us. It's very mentally draining to go shopping because of this factor. So people tend to engage in impulsive buying because of these reasons. It's like sort of a shortcut to avoid this mental exhaustion. Okay, so after formulating their hypotheses, they had to test them, and they go on to step 2, which is the survey phase. They wrote 75 survey items, which they gave to 272 people to complete. And with this, they are trying to create a hedonic scale, which is a scale that helps measure the impulsive level of a certain person when buying something. They use analysis of variance as their analysis method, and they try to differentiate between different levels of intensity in buying behaviors. Okay, so they have 2 methods that they use, which is this alpha that tries to utilize consistency to measure the scales that they created or that they used, because they did not use one specific scale for everything. They have different scales for the different things they are trying to measure. They just created this one, the hedonic one. So this alpha is trying to measure that different questions aimed at measuring one specific concept actually is the same for all of them. So if a person says they find shopping fun when answering one question, they should also answer that it's entertaining when answering another question. They used exploratory factor analysis as well for testing the validity of their scales. So this allows to the emerge of categories to classify different factors like novelty and emotional lift in people. And finally, to avoid repetition of items in these scales and to avoid noisy classifications, through iteration and comparison, they remove things that are too similar and end up with a clear and concise view of the whole classification. Okay, so they actually found through this testing that hypotheses 1 and 3 were supported. So the first one means that impulsive buying is actually tied to people finding it fun and bringing them joy. The third hypothesis means that people also engage in impulsive buying behaviors because it's gonna make them be better perceived by their colleagues and people they work with, for example. Hypothesis 2 was actually refuted in a way because interviews or qualitative data supports it. However, quantitative methods were not sufficient to prove it because they used the social scale that was not strong enough, not accurate enough to use, and actually provide strong enough results to prove it. Hypothesis 4 was also supported, which means that people in both extremes of the scale, very impulsive and very cautious buyers, are actually pretty confident about their purchases, and the people who are actually affected by this behavior are the people in the middle that neither take a shortcut into buying something quickly to avoid this laborious process, neither people that take a long time investigating and comparing products and actually making sure that they're making the right decision. Okay, something interesting is that they also found that people of all ages, races, sexes engage in this behavior equally. It doesn't affect the results, so we are all equally probable to do this in our lives. Hypothesis 5 was divided in two, and the first part was refuted, so they didn't find a correlation between putting mental effort into the buying process and people actually feeling secure about their purchases. So it's not correlated, and spending time making sure you're gonna like the thing you buy doesn't actually mean you're gonna end up be so certain about it at the end. However, 5B was supported, and they found that highly impulsive people find these decisions very, very hard. So yeah, like I said, buying is a rational shortcut, is not something irrational as previously thought in the beginning, but it's rather our way to escape this mental weight we have in our lives from our jobs or families. So it's actually a helpful thing to escape these behaviors. Okay. So, like I said, many people at the end of the day don't think impulsive buying is a bad thing because it makes them feel good, and the primary goal is to achieve personal satisfaction and happiness and to feel good about ourselves. And it's not at all related to economic reasons because people don't buy things for the product itself. They buy it for the feeling it brings them. And the bottom line is consumers use this as an escape mechanism. And yeah, I think this paper was overall very well written and structured. It was very clear. The writers bring us along the way in their methods and research. So it's very easy to keep up with the things they are doing and how they evolve the study. So thank you.
Let's have a discussion. You're welcome to sit there or come back or whatever. But maybe can you leave the slides up a bit because I want to go through them. If you don't mind.
Sure.
But I would like us to have a discussion about the paper a bit. Now that we've gotten familiar with it. Why do I think this is a good paper? I think this is a good paper. I signed it for class. Why do I think that? What's good about it? What are all the things about this paper that might get me excited? Yeah, Andy.
We spent a lot of time discussing the mechanisms of like how people feel during and how that affects the impulse buying instead of just exploring other parts of the impulse buying themselves. They specifically look at the mechanisms.
Okay, so the depth, right? They go into great depth into the mechanisms, not just the surface level thing, but they sort of go into the why. Why is this happening? Yes, 100% like that about this paper. What else?
the confirming methods, the interview backed up by analysis.
Say more.
When you have, if you just had an interview study, you would not have the numerical data and the hypotheses motivated. But having both sides of that means that you don't justify hypothesis, you have data to confirm or refute the hypothesis. And the fact they refuted some is a very strong point there.
Yeah, right. So like this was also not a short paper. It was not a quick, shallow paper, and I don't know, its composition, right? They did lots of things. There's lots of moving parts, and they all fit together into this greater story, right? The interviews by themselves, they could have written those up. In CS papers, we don't have this culture of writing extremely complex papers. I guess length is a proxy for that. We don't have that culture. We usually write, short papers on usually narrow results, usually one set of analyses or data or whatever. Other fields of science do not have this flaw that we have in CS as much. So you can see how, this is a great mixed methods study in that, it has this. By the way, did you notice how many interviews did they do? Did you notice?
Hundreds.
Different. So that was 272.
60?
No, that was for the survey. Yeah.
60 interviews.
Yeah.
They did 60 interviews that each took about an hour. And then they transcribed those recordings. And then they did all of this laborious qualitative analysis entirely manually, because this is before we used AI for that. Okay? Can you imagine how much work went into just this part of the paper? That's only the beginning, right? So this part of the paper resulted in a set of hypotheses, right? So they were building theory, right? They had they had proposed this theory, meaning the set of hypotheses about why this behavior is happening. Which, I mean, they could have stopped there, right? And they did not. They did not stop there. Then they sort of did a second paper on top of the first one, all in one, right? Then, they designed the survey instrument, scaled up the qualitative analysis on a larger sample, and then collected additional quantitative data this time to statistically test those hypotheses that they had proposed from the first set of interviews. And it wasn't just yes, everything checks out, right? They actually went into a lot of discussion about what holds, what doesn't, why things might be different, right? So there's a lot of stuff happening in this one paper. But this is a great study. The paper is a separate question, right? It's also a great paper and how it's written, but it's a great study, right? That has components that are different, that fit together well, that sort of reinforce each other, right? Each of these by themselves would have been weaker, right? If they had stopped after interviews with hypotheses, that would have been a weaker study, right? Because we would have not had all of this additional evidence about which of these things hold more broadly. If they had just done a survey, it would have also been a weaker study because would have been unclear where the different hypotheses and measures and all of those things were coming from. Right, so there's a lot of work that went into just figuring out what goes in the survey. Right? So each of these by themselves would have been weaker. Together, they sort of have this strong package. What else? Why do I like this? Is there anything else? What did you like about it? What?
The relationship part was great, that they studied the Cronbach alpha test that they did to understand that whether the hypotheses are really good or not. That was interesting, at least beyond the simple interviews.
Okay, so there's some. We'll talk more about what all of this means and how this works. There's the perception of rigor. It appears that they've done whatever they've done rigorously, right? That's sort of throughout the paper, you get this impression that all the different elements have been crafted or whatever, done rigorously. I agree. Anything else?
I personally found that I found it really interesting how the authors try to expand the idea of rationality, which is something that's not often, it's not easy to challenge in terms with emotions and stuff. So the attempt itself of flipping the idea was sort of
Yeah, great. So the topic of today's class and of, I don't know, we've been talking about this already last time, is theory, right? So how do they use theory here? Right? How does theory fit into this study? What kind of theory? How do they use it? What do they do with it? Where does it come up? This is to your point, I think. How do they use theory? What theory do they use? How do they use it? Why is that exciting?
I think they actually go back to previous studies to get some of the theory, but they also allow the theory to come naturally from the answers to the surveys and by answering the hypothesis they created.
Right. So they not only, but they use theories that others have built to inform their study. They build theory themselves as a result of the interviews. We just discussed this. They test the same theory that they've built just a component ago. Right? They test it empirically themselves. They refine it as a result of this, right? There are parts of the theory as formulated initially from the interviews that do not hold empirically in their second study, right? So they go back and refine, they adjust the theory, right? And then they go, Andy mentioned this earlier, they go into these mechanisms, right? So the contribution here is not just empirical, but rather it's theoretical and quite deep, right? They challenge existing theory and propose new mechanisms behind some widespread phenomenon. Has anybody bought anything impulsively recently? What have you bought? Impulse purchases? I bought some Legos from China, the knockoffs. Personally, recently. Really? Nobody impulse shops? Yeah.
I impulse shop food mostly, so I almost bought coconut fish.
So I do mention this, I think every time we read this paper, I end up mentioning this. My wife does not allow me to go grocery shopping because I impulse grocery shop. It's like, she makes a list and I do not stick to the list. I mean, obviously I buy the things on the list, but I also buy all the other things that are, interesting in the grocery store, especially desserts, which is why I'm banned from going grocery shopping. But yeah, I totally understand this tendency. And then, no, you're all very rational. In fact, impulse purchasing is rational, as they argue. I'm surprised. I think previous editions of the course have had a lot more instances of impulse purchases. Okay. Anything else about the paper? Is there anything we don't like? Just love it? That's it? Come on, give me something.
So the one thing I was thinking about is in the first somewhere the rationality argument that in the end they conclude that it is rational, and the confidence argument that people who impulse buy and people who think a lot, they both are confident about their purchases. Now, I'm not so sure about that impulse part of it because it feels like to justify myself that this was a good decision, I can also portray confidence when I do impulse buying. That was one question that came in my mind when I was thinking about it, that after impulse buying, somehow I have to justify that, oh, I did not do wrong when I did that impulse buy. And that can trigger that confidence, which is kind of a result of trying to protect myself from I'm losing the word, from the judgment of myself that, oh, I should not have done this.
So you're questioning the theory here? You're not questioning the study or the paper so much. You're questioning the theory or?
The theory is based on what people are saying in the interviews and surveys, right?
Right.
And as in, okay, if I put myself in the shoes of impulse guy, which I am for quite a few things, but I would just try to convince myself that this was a good decision.
Got it. Got it. You just cannot trust the people, cannot trust. what-
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
There was a show that I used to like a lot called House MD. I don't know if anybody has ever watched this.
Yeah.
So Hugh Laurie is playing this doctor who refuses to meet or talk to any of his patients because he assumes that everybody lies. He assumes that he cannot trust anything his patients are saying about the cause of their symptoms or whatever, and instead uses all of this observational data or whatever, sends his minions to, I don't know, spy on the people and so on, like tries to collect objective evidence that does not come from the people themselves directly, because he does not trust them. So this is a great point. I agree with this. I think if you were to go one step further still, right, you would, in this research program, you would think of a way to collect data from a different source that would allow you to test some of the same hypotheses and to see to what extent some of these social desirability biases about people not willing to admit that they've made a mistake when questioned, those might not be present if you look at their I don't know, other kinds of data perhaps. Yeah, Tristan.
I think one way they try to mitigate this is through not telling people
I had a point.
that
Yes.
they are not actually asking about
Yes.
impulsive
To their
directly.
credit, they tried really best too. But even then, when you not say, like even someone is asking about shopping behaviors in general, I think there would still be this bias present, unless what Pogman said that any other sources can confirm what is being portrayed in them.
I forgot about the deception part. Thanks for reminding me.
Yeah.
This was a really important design decision here. Right? They used deception in their study to because the topic was sensitive, because they expected the respondents couldn't be as honest as they would like them to be. They used deception to try to get closer to the truth.
Yeah.
And you could do this, and when you file your IRB protocol, for example, they ask you if your study uses deception, and and you have to argue why that's ethical and sort of how you're doing this. But that was a good point. Thanks for reminding me. A good design decision. So let me see if I had any other thoughts on things.
This one.
I have a question.
Of course. Yeah, please.
So, not saying it's a flaw, but I'm still not sure if they should call it a rational decision. It is a way for people to reduce their mental exhaustion, but that doesn't qualify as rational because there are like 10 ways to reduce your mental exhaustion, and maybe this is not the rational way of it. So I don't know if the claim of it being a rational thing is too far-fetched.
I interpret this as deliberate, rational as in deliberate. Right. So I'm doing this to deliberately reduce mental effort.
Mhm.
In that sense, it's a rational thing I do, right? It's not just an, I don't know, biological or psychological impulse. It's a rational thing I do because the other thing is taxing. So I choose not to do the harder thing.
Yeah.
That's my read of this. Let me see if I had any other thoughts on things here. We talked about the mixing, talked about 60. Oh yeah, one thing here. So 60 sounds like a lot of interviews. How do you know when to stop? Let's say you're doing interviews, and we're going to talk more about this next week also. But you start doing interviews, you collect data as you go along. In fact, you mentioned something very interesting, something about wrong one. It looks the same. Like it's the same. Something about constant comparison.
Yeah.
So this is sort of the technical term for a method here, where they iteratively analyze the interview data as they're collecting it, rather than, you don't just do 60 interviews in a vacuum, collect all this data and only then start analyzing it. You do interviews and start analyzing, the data you get out of them along the way, and you adapt your, subsequent interviews based on things you're learning from the first ones and whatnot. So sort of doing this constantly. Yep. So it's adapting the questions. Possibly, you're adapting questions, you're adapting your theory, you could be, yeah, exactly, yes.
But you could actually like change your interview along the way.
In fact, it'd be useful to do that, right? Because, you're learning that the initial questions you had asked were maybe not the right questions. So you adapt your set of questions, right? And you go in this different direction.
But then this study would not be like defined, right? Like when I'm writing the paper, like for interview, like participant A, B, C, we asked this, and then E, F, because we improved, we asked something else.
This is the positivist in you. So, forcing you to. So, but remember the goal here. The goal is to understand this phenomenon richly. But the goal is not to understand it narrowly within the original scope of your protocol. Right? You're a social constructivist. You're looking to understand this as richly as you can. All of the dimensions of it, as many as you can capture. But let's go back to 60, right? So, like, how do you end up with 60? Right? There was a really important bit here, and we're going to talk more about this when we talk about interviews. But how do you end up with 60? Right? You don't start by saying committing yourself to doing 60 interviews, I don't think.
Well, I guess when the answers start converging to the same thing.
Yeah, right. So that's really a super key idea with this kind of work. You mentioned this concept, I don't know if you have it here, of theoretical saturation.
Yeah.
Is it here?
Yeah, in the second one.
Great. Right. That's also not a technical term. So the idea is that at some point, right, you may begin, in fact, at some point you are expected to converge on what you're hearing. Right, so the theory you're building about, for example, why people make these purchases, you start hearing the same reasons over and over again, right, by doing more interviews. So this is when you make a judgment call as the researcher, more or less informally, and you say, look, I'm going to stop. I'm not going to do additional interviews because I keep hearing the same things over and over again from the ones that I've done so far, right? So that could be as early as after, a dozen, or could be as late as after 60, or, who knows, right? But there's no magic number here is what I'm trying to say. There's no magic number of 60 or 12 or however many, right? The number is always determined through this reasoning about theoretical saturation. When do you not learn anything new anymore? And, that's when you can begin to stop. So by the way, so this also would vary widely with the sample. So, let's say I interview you all here about something, I don't know, we've learned about in class. There will likely be less diverse opinions amongst you, right? Then if I interview, one representative from each class across, different classes, right? Because everybody will have sort of, come from different backgrounds, will have been exposed to different things, etc. So the sample, the actual sample construction will have a huge impact on this idea of saturation, theoretical saturation, right? So again, like the social constructivist, right? You can never, do this fully, right? You're doing this in whatever context you're interested in studying it, the phenomenon. But it will, it may vary widely depending on the sample you have access to. Right? You can expect, right, and this is why they do this follow-up survey thing. You can expect that your findings are generalizable, right? This is why they test them using a different sample and maybe a larger scale. You can expect that, that's desirable, but that's not something you can take for granted, right? Like it could be the case that you discover different concepts or parts of your theory if you use a different sample. And it could be a case that you reach saturation much earlier or much later, right? Depending on that. Okay, let's see if there was anything else that was interesting.
When one of your hypotheses get refuted even after this convergence, does that mean the questions you adapted to were wrong? Or you were kind of biasing the people towards answering something?
So the meta point, I think, is that this is not how science works. Like knowledge is built incrementally and iteratively over long periods of time through a multitude of studies on the same topic. Look at what medical research does. I don't know, policy and whatnot, practices about treatments and so forth are based on these, I don't know, Cochrane reviews of tons and tons and tons of studies, right? In different contexts and with different methods and different samples and whatever else. And decisions are made, eventually based on these aggregate effects from lots of different studies. So to your point earlier, right? It's never any one paper ever. It's just not how it works. I think, by the way, so another interesting cultural difference in computer science areas, we don't really have this culture of doing replications and studying the same phenomenon through different lenses or different populations or whatever. Very little of this, much less so than in medical research. So actually, for us, it's much harder, to accumulate this kind of lasting, durable, solid empirical evidence about anything, right? Because we don't usually exhaustively test anything, at least not to the same extent.
Makes sense.
Okay. Let's see, is there anything else? Talked about the methods. Yeah, we're going to talk more about the specifics. That's not super relevant. Yeah, good, perfect. Thank you. That's great. So let me stop here with this, unless anything else.
Should I stop presenting?
Yeah, you can stop presenting.
You are
There we
from
go.
research.
There we go. So we're going to talk about a familiar Facebook profile, elements as signals in an online social network. This is a 2007 paper, and one of the things before we even get started, I'm going to have to remind myself of is 2007 was not yesterday. So Facebook was a very different platform at that time.
Let's
Hmm?
I'm here. I was going to say less evil, but I'm here.
Very different. The fact that it's still geographically tied was quite a head turner for me. So keeping it pretty high level here, the problem that they are looking at is these online social networks, not just Facebook, are supposed to digitize real world relationships, but they do it in a computer mediated communication fashion. And in these mediated communications, users are not signaling as they would in person with facial expressions and clothing. They are using user profiles to self-present and mediate these connections. The direct gap here that they're talking about is we have these profiles, but no one knows what part of the profiles people are actually looking at and are influencing how these connections are made. And they are trying to address this, drawing on social theories to say, what are the parts of these profiles? What is the theory that says why someone would use this part of the profile as opposed to another part of the profile? This is the problem gap hook format. I also did a summary in a different form that I've seen. There's also this equivalent format. Have you seen this?
I don't think so.
So this is another format that it's the SRI format, so Stanford Siri. They suggest using this format for value proposition results and presenting it in terms of need, approach, benefit, and competition. So very similar, but you also come up with a slightly different view of the paper here. So the need here is that in time and attention limited situations, people need to know which of these profile elements to put out. So they put the kind of approach at the beginning. This particular paper analyzed that need, looking at 30,000 usable profiles. There were a few more that they filtered from members of the Michigan State University community in 2007, which they analyzed with multiple regression analysis to see which clusters of profile elements were most strongly associated to the total number of friends. They found that particular classes of those elements were in fact impactful, the things that they could falsify and hedge validity from other people they knew. And the competition is that if you just don't think about what are the impactful ones, you spend all your time filling out these profiles and don't get very much. So they explicitly called out their research questions here. So what are the relationships between the various types of profile fields and the number of friends that users have on these social media sites? And are some types of profile entries more strongly associated with the number of friends list? As I said, the method collection here is they wrote their own scripts to gather data here, 30,000 users in a single social network, largely geographically bounded. They did multiple regression analysis, and then they grounded this all in signaling theory, common ground theory, and transaction cost theory to understand people's behaviors in these social networks. There were 10 tables, so I won't go through all of the results, but this is meant to just illustrate some of them. These are the two kind of buckets of results. They had a lot of what we would today call summary statistics, exploratory data analysis, just saying what people actually did on these sites as opposed to what we think they do on these sites. And then they use that to analyze, can you predict the number of friends? And so they have data analysis to support that too. That's the regression results. I'm not going into super amounts of detail there. I wanted to get on to a couple of the important discussion points that they called out here. The first one is kind of obvious that filling out more of your profile is in fact correlated with having more friends. Again, seems straightforward that that's the easy story. Even so, I'm glad someone tested and confirmed that. But then they went further with this, and this was the quote that really stuck with me. If it were simply the amount of information that was the determining factor of the number of friends, we would expect that each profile element predicted the number of friends with roughly the same rate, roughly equally. So they didn't see that. So they're able to use the social theories that we just talked about to say where these are different. And then they also were able to infer more nuanced things about people's behavior here in terms of why they are searching and what they are searching for. This was an example they gave. High schools, shared high school was a strong predictor here, whereas shared interests were not. And they tried to infer then that people are more seeking out or more trust information about who went to their high school than who has similar tastes in books and films. In terms of the strengths of this paper, I really liked that they gathered real data from a realistic scenario. These are, there are plenty of papers here that do not do that. So the fact they went out and gathered their own data was, I thought, a real strength here. The use of 3 distinct theories was a real strength here. The grouping significantly improved the results, that this gave them theoretical motivation for the groupings that they made and the claims that they made. And it also made for the results to be more understandable. I'm sure you've all seen papers as well where they have groupings of predictive factors that are just what came out of the model, and you can't actually interpret or understand why or have any theory for them. I'm missing context here.
Just had a discussion yesterday about such a paper.
I really like that they use these descriptive statistics to say what people are doing, how these profiles are being filled out, because that's telling you not just what is seen and what people are doing, but it's telling you something about the level of effort people are willing to put into it. It's feeding into the social theories here. And it's kind of silly to call it out in a strengths, but I thought this paper had a very nice limitations section. They were very clear in the limitations of their approach, which I appreciated because it was not just being honest about the limitations of their work, but it made the work more understandable as a whole. You read that limitation section and you understood better what the rest of the work did. That said, there were some weaknesses that I would have called out if I were reviewing this. 30,000 users is pretty limited even in 2007. Facebook had millions at that point, especially when there is a known geographic bias in the selection. I just gave them credit for that in the strengths. They called it out as a weakness or as a limitation, but that does limit the applicability of their results. I called out that the profile fields, while they were well grounded in theory, they are artificial constructs from the platform, not built from social theory or behavior themselves, and they're subject to change. I didn't put a picture of it, but one of the profile elements was AOL Instant Messenger, which has been defunct for decades now. So relying on those generated artifacts is just a proxy for what they're actually getting at. That's not bad, but it is subject to change. It wasn't clear to me that predicting the number of friends is really what you want to do in a social network. This felt more like collecting friend Pokemon than actually finding something useful. Whereas with the motivation at the beginning, they talked about it being a digital representation of a real network. So I totally accept the digital representation of the real network as an interesting question, but that was not quite well tied to the number of friends metric that they used. And then the last one is sort of what's the way to say this? Multi-regression analysis is a course tool. It's not causal, it's not mechanistic. I don't actually fault them too much for it. It let them get results. They did analysis with data that they gathered, and I will always give them credit for that. But I would certainly want to see follow-on studies with more sophisticated analysis there. And that's what I have. So,
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I'm curious to hear more strengths and weaknesses that you have all identified that Rob and Bernie mentioned.
So for myself, like if I wanted to conduct this kind of research, right, and to find like the relationship between the profile and the number of friends, the first factor myself will consider is that how long the account has been set up, right? Even though you have a perfect profile, but if you just join the platform for just 1 week, definitely you will have less friends. So, but I didn't see this factor discussed in the paper or in this presentation.
I think there was some discussion of length of profile, and that may have been also included in some of the filtering.
Right, age.
Age, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't remember off the top of my head. Okay. Great comments. I agree with this.
Yes.
To me, this looks like a very shallow study. I don't know. There's just a lot of data collected and some stats done.
So,
Like if you have to observe the impact of a particular field, you would study the profiles which don't have that field versus profiles that do, and then see how the final outcome changes.
so that was my first reaction too.
Yeah.
And I changed my mind because I think that going back here, the real impact of this paper is not about any social network or the profile itself. It's on the signaling theories. It's about what people are doing that you can observe with this platform, not the platform itself. So you're using the platform as a mechanism to observe social behavior and inform the social theories, not saying anything about Facebook.
I don't understand that.
This is $1 million point. I really want you to get this. It's a really critical point. Yes, this paper is about Facebook. It's also in the title, but really this paper is not at all about Facebook. Like, it's superficially about Facebook, but it is not fundamentally about Facebook. This paper is about human networks and how they form. Or I don't know, what would you say?
Social networks, I think that's right. And about how their behavior is different online and in person.
Yes. Right.
And the same.
Yeah, it's about this contrast between human social networks in the real world versus human social networks online. None of this is about Facebook. The fact that they start from theories that had nothing to do with Facebook, right? And they look for, instances of those mechanisms on the Facebook platform, makes it not about Facebook. Do you get this? So let's talk about a really critical point here. A second critical point you have maybe on your next one. You have this thing about, which I agree with the principle, it's only 30,000 users. But how can we know?
Yes.
How can we know if this is a more general phenomenon than just at Michigan State? Yeah, Michigan State, right? So, really important point. So let's spend a minute on this. How do we generalize any kind of knowledge or claims about anything? I claim that there are fundamentally only two ways in which we do this, only two. What are the two ways in which we can generalize observations, findings, conclusions, whatever you want to call them, from the sample in which they've been drawn from to a larger sample or population as a whole? What are the two mechanisms through which we do this?
Statistical significance. Tests for the different methods of using.
You'll get more statistical significance if you sample more broadly. So you could, instead of 30,000, we'll sample the entire world, and then you would draw a different conclusion or broader conclusion.
I agree with one of the words in your response, but not the other. So I'll comment on this. Give me a second. What else? Or what, if not this?
Do you mean the population which is characteristically the same? Like, for example, in this case, do you mean that same across all social networks in colleges, or do you mean like social networks in general?
So, claim here or concern is that if we were to study other campuses or the network overall, we would not observe the same behavior or would not draw the same conclusions that we drew from the study of Michigan State. That's the concern. So I'm asking, how might we be confident, if ever possible, that whatever we're observing at Michigan State would generalize to whatever, to CMU or to the entire, population of Facebook users?
You don't have to check correlation between geographical location and the actual results.
Forget about the specifics of this study. Like, what are the mechanisms through which we can generalize any kind of observations or claims?
Randomness bias.
Replication.
Yes. Yes. Yes, without doing additional work. how much we trust that this can hold elsewhere? What would be?
You try to disassociate the findings from the demographic factors.
Which is okay, yeah, good, that's a good question, yeah, so.
We can have some case study, right? We can get some people in some other places, just see that whether they fit into the theory or function.
Yes, yes, we could do that work, it's like replication, but we're lazy, right? Well, what would we need to, be able to,
Understanding the mechanism.
okay, yes, so I mean, I've made this point before, this is one, so we'll wrap this up in a second. The mechanism part, the theory part, what's the other one?
Statistical, you'd argue that the representation here, that this is representative of elsewhere.
Yeah, so I mean, surely you have seen, I don't know, political polling. Maybe the most obvious example of this. Right, when the pollsters make predictions about which candidate would win some election, they don't ask every single voter who they're going to vote for. Right, you know this. They always ask a few hundred voters who they would vote for. Right, and then they would generalize statistically with some margin of error. Right, they're saying their sample of however many they talk to is representative of the population of voters at large, with this level of statistical confidence or within this margin of error, some such thing, some such argument, a statistical argument. You're drawing random samples from a population, observing something on those random samples, and then you can generalize within the bounds of, I don't know, sampling theory to the population as a whole. This is one fundamental mechanism through which you can generalize findings, right? So here, you've drawn a sample from Michigan State, from the population of Facebook campuses overall, and you've observed something at Michigan State. And the question is, to what extent is this sample at Michigan State representative of the population overall? If it were random, it would be with high confidence, right? But it is not, right? It's not random, so we don't quite know. Right? Hence the concerns, right? But if it were random, right? So like random sampling is a great way of knowing something beyond the sample in which you're measuring it, right? Within the bounds of sampling theory and whatever, with margins of error, right? That's one. The second one, the other one that we've been talking about this last couple of meetings, is through theory, it's called analytical generalization as opposed to statistical generalization, right? So we have some understanding of the underlying mechanisms, and we can analytically make predictions about other instances where those same mechanisms would apply. So here, actually, right, I think the argument is very strong that this is a durable, more generalizable finding. Because the mechanism did not come, the theories that they use to understand this did not come from Michigan State. They came from whatever, sociology, economics, whatever else, from much broader places to begin with. They came from people to begin with, right? They just happened to study these empirically in this new context at Michigan State on Facebook Online, but they came from much farther and much broader away, right? So yes, I think I would argue that, other campuses would also, people at other campuses on Facebook would also be similarly subject to some of the same mechanisms here about signaling theory, about what were the other ones? I don't remember. I had them on your previous one.
Economic cost theory and
Common ground theory.
common ground theory. Yeah.
These are things that people do everywhere, so far as we can tell. Right, so yes, they do them at Michigan State too, it turns out, right, because they found empirical evidence, consistent with these mechanisms. So probably they also do them at Carnegie Mellon and elsewhere. So and you're right. How do we know for sure? We go and do replications and whatever. We test this empirically, right? That's if you actually want to test this, you have to go do the work. But otherwise, you can expect analytically, right? that these findings would generalize to other contexts where the same mechanisms apply. It's the same point I've been making the last couple of meetings about theory. This is why having theory, using theory is useful, because it gets you away from the always, like inevitably narrow, small context and sample where you're studying something to something bigger, which is good. Marco, yeah.
So that argument somewhat makes sense, but I'm still finding it hard that at the end of the day, everything is a Facebook artifact, right? Because the tool is made, it has some particular UI, it has some particular features. I have option of writing my country at some place in that box, and maybe like my interests are somewhere at the bottom.
Yep.
At the end of it, there are some data artifacts because of Facebook.
Sure.
You can't ignore that and say that the study is not about Facebook and the underlying thing.
Okay, so it's not about Facebook, right? So if let's assume for the sake of argument that they had not used any theory to guide them towards what they're measuring and how they're interpreting their findings. Let's say they had done this entirely as a sort of data science project purely, without any of this sort of broader theoretical input. Let's say that they've done that. How would that have looked like? What would a study like this look like? Pure data science.
Well, then you'd have to sample every person or something like that.
No, so it's the same sample. Like Michigan State, Facebook profiles. What would you have done differently?
Just collected all possible data and then did all possible correlations in the world and made all possible claims about that.
That's the data science approach, right? The traditional stereotypical data science approach is measure literally everything you can measure and then throw some machine learning at it and see what sticks, right? It's literally like it's fundamentally very different. Right? The one is measure precisely some things that are operational versions of these theoretical constructs. That's that here. The other one is measure literally everything and anything that's possibly measurable, and then just throw machine learning at it and see what sticks.
I mean, but at the end of the day, that would be a superset of this anyway, right? It's just that for some of these correlations, you have theories to back them up. For some, you don't.
But so the fundamental difference is this ability to reason about mechanisms. If you do what they did here, right, the result of this downstream analysis is some understanding of the mechanisms. It helps you understand the mechanisms better. If you do the ML thing, you have no idea about the mechanisms. You just see, what is statistically correlated with what, which could be useful for making predictions, sure. But you have no idea why these things are happening, right? So, I've been making also this other point about how this understanding of mechanisms is very satisfying, and not having it is very unsatisfying to me personally. Like I disagree, I think fundamentally that this is a shallow study, precisely because of this reason. The shallow study would have been measure everything and throw a ML at it and see what sticks. This is not at all that. This is a very deep study because it brings in not one but three theoretical frameworks into the design and interpretation of the findings here. So to me, these could not have been further apart.
Makes sense.
So this is why I think this is a great paper. And by the way, 2007, like empirical sophistication of people in CS has increased substantially over the last 2 decades now. This even today, right? I think this would be a very solid paper. even today, I would be excited about this paper because of, this like theoretical reasoning and reasoning about mechanisms and whatever else. Really good writing and discussion of limitations. So I don't know if you've noticed this. I have some annotations in my version. Everywhere they do something operationally, they measure something, they make some decision about what to measure and what not, what to filter. They have a lengthy explanation of ways in which this is limited. But so you would think intuitively, right, when you're writing a paper like this, you would think like the instinct is probably to try to hide all of these flaws, right? If you're the author, you probably want to hide all of these flaws that you're aware of yourself, right? And hope the reviewers don't notice. Right, that would be the, I think, natural instinct. Right here, they do exactly the opposite. Not only do they not hide this, but they don't even, yes, they mention it in the paper, but they don't even like bury it in the paper. They mention it front and center, right next to where they explain the main points, right? They explain the main point and the limitations of what they're doing, all at the same time, so you cannot miss it. Right? So, like, you would worry that the paper would get rejected if you are honest about all these limitations. It's exactly the opposite. The paper gets rejected because you end up over-claiming, right? Because you end up hiding, all of these limitations, and reviewers maybe, notice, right? Not only was this paper not rejected, but also it accumulated, I don't know, 1,000+ citations by now. Okay, let me pause here. More questions or comments? We're almost out of time, so I don't want to keep you over. So hopefully get a feel from these two papers about how one could use theory both as input to the research, which is the second paper, as well as output of their research, which was the impulse buying paper. And also write well, I guess, as a side effect. Both of these, I think, were well-written. I think I mentioned this before. So a lot of how I learned to write papers is by reading good papers and literally trying to clone or copy what they're doing, both in terms of structure of the logical arguments, structure of the paper, style of writing. Just like by absorbing, good writing and style, I try to mimic it myself. So this is what I'm trying to do with this class as a side effect. All right, I'll see you next week. Thanks a lot, Rob.